Okay, well, I guess welcome back, viewers. This is, I guess, Code Talk Teach, our talk show here at Oasis Digital, where we talk about various nerdy things related to software development, often kind of drifting toward the architecture end of things. I am Kyle Cordes. You guys say hello.
Paul Spears.
And David Moore.
So I guess our usual thing is we have kind of random little topics of the week, and then we have a handful of topics we actually went to the effort of announcing on Twitter. So I guess I'll throw out the easy one. The topic of the week is, wow, how did Facebook go down for an entire day?
I wish I could say it was like, glorious and had a big impact on me, but I would have never noticed unless someone else told me. So
I only noticed because I had recently ordered an Oculus Quest 2, and they sent me an email that said, hey, go here and learn more, and it didn't go anywhere.
I only noticed because it was like the topic of attention everywhere. You go on Twitter, every other tweet was about Facebook. You turn on the news, and the news has a story that Facebook is having an outage.
Yeah.
I guess that's a metric of success, though. How do you know you've really made it in the internet world? When the television news mentions when you have an outage. That's.
There was another company recently that had a similar outage for a similar reason. I can't recall it at the moment, but basically it was a configuration goof. And I read into what happened with Facebook, and it's a different situation, but it was effectively the same thing. A configuration change happened, and it went wrong.
Yeah,
the whole service went down.
That was my understanding. Is that they pushed some configuration change, and unfortunately, it was an incorrect, accidental, erroneous configuration change. But somehow the means by which they would send the fix was broken by the change, something about routing or something.
Yeah,
and we're not a details of how the internet is routed show, so I don't feel bad about not being able to dig into the story. But I think just organizationally, there's got to be some really interesting things going on there, and I think that there are probably some failure modes that are not unique to Facebook.
I can give
around things like if you insist on everything is going to run exactly this way through this channel. We're going to really get everything centralized. It's going to be exactly our way. That has big benefits, but that also creates single point of failure situations. Like Facebook, there's no Facebook status page you can look at that's hosted externally.
Right.
It's really nice if you have any kind of online service to have an externally hosted status page.
Yeah, I can give kind of a capsule of
you have a strange
how it works.
Audio, David. Your audio it jumped up and down by like 20 decibels. I don't know if there's some kind of noise gate or something, but
perhaps. I don't have anything on there in particular. But the capsule of what happened was, so there's the DNS domain name service, which translates, Facebook.com into IP addresses. There's a layer under that that basically says, hey, Facebook owns all of these IPs.
Yeah.
And
send them over here.
Here's how it connects to the internet.
Yeah.
And for some reason, which is still under investigation, that layer, the updates to the internet as a whole, which is distributed, were pulled. So it said, hey, remove this entire set of IPs, and including all of the DNS associated to it from the internet entirely, which included Facebook and Oculus and Instagram and everything.
They accidentally deleted themselves from the internet.
Yes.
The one tweet summary I heard.
And because they deleted themselves, I believe that's why they couldn't re-add themselves, because they were disconnected from the internet.
Right. The wire was still plugged in.
Yeah.
But the things on both ends had been configured to pretend there was no wire.
Right. It's pretty crazy.
Anyway, so I'm going to assume that everyone involved there has, just epic amounts of expertise and experience. And this is just an example of, even when you throw just unlimited amounts of expertise, experience, and money at a problem, Murphy's Law is, in a sense, a true law of the universe. Uh, so I certainly wouldn't encourage anybody to, let up on their efforts because occasional failures are inevitable. But at the same time, if you're, say, a huge global organization that has spent 1% as much as Facebook has, and that's still a staggering amount of money, you're probably you're gonna get quite a few nines, but you're not gonna reach 1.0.
Right.
You're only gonna get some nines.
Well, there's a huge amount of money and time involved in getting
Yeah.
more and more nines.
Yeah.
By
the way, I somewhere saw like this is like they've blown their number of nines for. I mean, yeah, it's like
their site reliability numbers.
Yeah, I mean, you need like to get to a certain number, you need like seconds per year of outage, and like running up most of a day of outage globally, like they are far past any specifiable uptime percentage.
I think Facebook was down 20 hours back in like 2019 for a different reason, but yeah, this was I think the biggest that I'd heard of.
Yeah.
Because everything was down, even status pages and such. And I think what's going to happen is like it's really hard to remove that kind of single point of failure.
Yeah.
But I think what they'll probably end up doing, like just off the top of my head, would be to split up the number of they'd have like an emergency set of IPs that were also owned by Facebook, but not controlled by the same configuration.
Yeah.
And they'd be able to reconfigure.
Yeah, I'm sure that they're probably figuring out some massive architectural change to make this kind of failure really, really impossible to have happen again.
And there's no telling if it was a accidental thing, or if someone with the right keys was like being let go and didn't like that and made
and
intentionally.
I assume there'll be some rather fulsome investigation, and I guess there is a certain chance that we'll find out that the errant command was sent by an aggrieved former team member or something,
or an intern.
Usually you don't give the interns the access keys to your core routing infrastructure, but hey, who am I to say? I don't work at Facebook. Maybe you do.
I've heard stories, not from Facebook, but just in the general world.
Mm-hmm.
One, in fact, does give the keys to the kingdom to the interns all the time.
Yeah, I guess it does happen. Okay, well, aside from Schadenfreude about Facebook, what other sort of news of the week is going on that's worth mentioning?
Had the local Strange Loop conference this last weekend.
Yeah, I was signed up for it, but I was too lazy to actually drive down there, Paul. I apologize for leaving you hanging. I realized that I was tired and I had interesting things to do, and that I could catch the 1/3 most interesting talks later on video, and I confess I lazied out of going down there with you. How was it?
It was okay. Yeah, it was different. Things are changing, so there's some adjustments to get used to. Like the hallway track was like wasn't what it had been in the past. They had mask mandates in place, and
I have to think that the hallway tracks are essentially dead until masks are over.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. They had the space for it, but it didn't really take like you'd imagine. Attendance was down compared to previous years.
Well, didn't I see they held it at Union Station only instead of as a split venue?
Right.
Because the numbers were down. Yeah.
Yep. And in terms of content, lots of folks. So if you're not familiar with Strange Loop is known for some kind of. It's hard to describe the content exactly, but it's like the intersection of tech plus other sections of the life and
it was like
the world.
It's like tech, culture,
introspective, cultural introspective intersecting with tech.
I remember early on they had a rule: no process talks and no sales pitch talks.
Right.
But they had like a lot of just like esoteric talks where you're like, how is this here? And then, it turns out to be very interesting.
Yeah. So the tendency for a lot of the talks is to like be about like functional programming ideas. Like folks that run it like really love functional programming languages. But this year there was a lot of machine learning, a lot of machine learning.
Well, that's been the case for the last several.
Yeah, and now it is deeper dives into much richer and practical applications that we're seeing from the talks. So it's
That's
not
great.
just here's a thing that knows how to tell the difference between a dog and a cat anymore. It is like here's an artistic piece of showing how live bodysuit data turned into a way to enhance my own personal artistic dance style. It's like much richer kinds of content about machine learning applications than what we've had in the past. And that was a pretty consistent theme this year.
Maybe you can, when the videos come out, you can share a few links to the very best talks. And for those of us who didn't go live.
Yeah, I've been wanting to go for like 10 years, but given that I live out of state, it's been difficult to make it down. And then, of course, COVID stuff. So
I was really amazed in some of the earlier years of Strange Loop, the just incredible density of people coming in from around the country and around the world to attend. It was like really impressive density of people, not from St. Louis, but not from within 500 miles of St. Louis, or not from within an ocean.
Yeah, a friend of mine years ago, that also a colleague, recommended it to me, and I have never been able to make it, just for one reason or another. So it's a life goal.
So now that we've had our Strange Loop Love Fest, any other news of the week? I guess I will. Paul just got back from a vacation, and I keep thinking that any minute now he's just going to suddenly shout out with some like amazing revelation that came to him from taking a good, decent, long vacation, and that he's going to have come back with some amazing insight that has evaded all of us for years. So no pressure, Paul, but you do have a quota to meet of amazing insights. Sorry, it's company policy, nothing I can do.
Yeah, well, the one insight that I have is that it was really hard to come back from that trip. I went out west, and at one point I was coding out on a back deck that was overlooking a little forest stream with the mountains behind it. And like at the place I was staying, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to kind of stay here, and they don't need me in St. Louis. I can stay here.
Yeah.
I need a forest, a mountain, an ocean, and a stream. All need to be within view while I code for maximum.
Yeah. Well, earlier this year, I was actually on it's a beach in South Carolina coding for a week. So
does that actually
benefits
work?
of remote programming.
I don't think I'd want to actually be on a beach.
It wasn't on the beach itself. I was in a beach house that was beach adjacent.
I've done like at a
nice
resort,
screened-in porch.
At a resort overlooking a beach, but not. I don't think I actually want. I don't think computers and beaches, computers and sand are not
Computers
a good.
and sand are not good.
Not a great combination.
Return it from whence it came.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to paste in here in the chat if I can here the kind of 4 ideas that they kind of ran together in this thing up. So it's really terrible how they just concatenated together. That's just awful. I might have to try again. But so the 4 ideas we had, just kind of throw on some big picture ideas this time to see what we feel like talking about, and then we will retroactively title this for what we talk about. We tend to get a very small live audience, but then more people going back and watching later. So I guess we just see what happens, then we title it correctly, and then some people enjoy it. So the first one was like coordinating at scale. And that could mean either people coordinating computers at scale or coordinating people at scale. We end up kind of being involved in both. And then sharing types across layers. So I don't necessarily care about the specific technologies for doing that, but that's like a big picture issue I see in lots of systems we touch, of sort of re-expressing data types differently in different layers of a system, and then having a kind of version skew or just lack of correctness. Then like how much to test? I've spent a fair amount of time the last couple weeks doing some migration of a system that had a bunch of Jasmine tests to be Jest tests instead. And although I think the details of that are maybe a little too in the weeds for our chatter here, it kind of got me thinking. How much testing, out of every 1,000 development hours, I wonder what is the right number of those hours to spend on tests. And then lastly, I found myself wondering, how do you know if you're building the right thing? So I don't know. Like, those seem like big enough, big picture questions. So who wants to grab one and run with it?
Those are all pretty good. The how are we even building the right application is very philosophical. I've worked on projects where I've literally said, can't we just do this with pencil and paper? Because it wasn't functionally that much better.
Okay, so one way to be not doing the right thing is to be creating an application that doesn't actually have value at all. Right?
Like, it might be replicating something that exists, but it doesn't do it as good, even if not better than what already exists.
Yeah, I know a lot of times I'll be implementing a form and realize that I've got all these fancy controls with trying to input data. I'm like, an Excel sheet would have made this a whole lot faster.
Speaking of that, I just passed around a link here to a couple people internally about a thing that basically uses Google's Firestore as a backend and then lets you basically have a spreadsheet to enter and query data and what's in it. And of course, we've had spreadsheets and online databases and online shared documents for many years, but that's just yet another take on the idea that it's amazing how often you can get by with just putting the data in a form that everybody can see, query, and add to it. Many, many problems can be solved sufficiently well without creating a new system, just by using something off the shelf that can get the data in front of you.
Yeah, it doesn't have as nice or clean a UI necessarily as a custom built application, but years ago I did an org chart, like a dynamic org chart that an admin could update, and they updated an Excel spreadsheet. But because of the technology that I had to work with at the time, it would take the Excel spreadsheet, suck it into an Access database, and then some ASPX would be the back end, and then Flash with early ActionScript 2 would suck that data up and then draw the org chart. We're
playing all the oldies today.
Yeah. But the point is the admin knew Excel, so it's super easy for them to update.
That's great.
Rather than write some weird custom thing that who knows it's going to be maintained.
And Excel has a bunch of great features for manipulating data that you're definitely not going to recreate on a little one-off single-use app.
Yeah, I don't know how many projects I've been in that have asked for a grid that effectively tried to duplicate everything in Excel.
Yeah, and actually, although a shout out to our folks over at AgGrid who make a grid that often
so much easier.
That often can replace what otherwise would have been a lot of custom development work. Like, let's configure this grid in a month instead of creating a system from scratch in a year, and do something else with those other 11 months. So my contribution to the building the right thing is this. I have sometimes been accused of wasting effort by writing up something, writing a few pages about what a system could do. Hey, let's make a piece of software that does this. It does this, 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 this. It does all this, this, and it has like these. It could work this way. It could work this way. Let's figure that out. And then we end up not building it. And I actually reject the idea that it is waste to think about something and then deciding to not build it, because I'm not comparing it to what if we had spent 1,000 hours building it But instead, I've spent 1,007 hours because of those 7 hours creating it at the beginning. Look, you've wasted 7 hours. I actually think that the far more common situation is, hey, before we jump into creating a big thing, let's spend a few hours with just like a spreadsheet or a word processor document, writing down our ideas, trying to hash them out. And it's actually totally okay if 70% of the time, the result of that process is deciding to either to not solve that problem after all, or to solve that problem in an off-the-shelf way. Now, obviously, the even better case would be to have such great judgment that you could make that judgment without putting in the effort to write down the ideas. I have found that I'm pretty sure my judgment is better about a thing if I write down the ideas, not in great detail, but in some detail first. So I think that writing down what you think you're going to maybe make can be a great tool to decide whether to build it, and can avoid getting into the existential misery of deciding months into a project that you're not sure if you're even building
the right thing.
Something you should be building.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know how that could be. Actually, I do know how some people could see that as a waste of effort. But I always found that if that happens ahead of time, that the final product is much more focused and much better, because you'll write those questions down, you'll write those requirements down, etc. And questions will occur to you. Oh, what happens in this situation? Or what if this? And sometimes that conversation spirals into a completely different line of thinking, and you end up making something completely different than what you originally thought. But you realize you only could have realized that by 1,000 hours of dev time, or 7 hours, using your numbers, 7 hours of writing a document down and talking about it.
Well, I think it actually often leads to the thing you were just describing, David. The idea of, you solved a problem in a system by saying, "Hey, let's take the whole data entry, data tracking. Let's make the system of record, the store of truth, be a spreadsheet that someone already knows how to edit, and then we'll only build something downstream of that system of record to do a certain kind of display or analysis of it." Mm-hmm. Right. Whereas if somebody had charted out, okay, whatever, Visual Studio's new solution, whatever, and started putting together CRUD forms without having planned out what is the right architecture, what is the right set of features to build versus use off the shelf, I think there's actually a lot of savings of not building something silly.
Yeah.
Thinking of it.
Yeah, you would end up with the kind of the golden hammer sort of problem is like, hey, I know Angular. Everything should be written in Angular. No, everything should not be written in Angular.
Heresy. Burn him.
Or not everything should be a web app. I know.
You're right. We should make it more.
I'm out. Everything should be a native mobile app, right?
Yeah, native mobile instead. It's just like you were saying, if Excel works, especially for internal things, you don't want to give your customer an Excel spreadsheet to enter everything in, but you do want to enable the people who are using that thing every day to be comfortable with it and use it in a powerful manner.
Yep.
And then maybe the reports that it spits out, that's really your app. And the number crunching that spits out those reports, that's where you want your development effort to be, not in a web Excel spreadsheet. Although, like we said, there are certain ones out there that will allow that sort of functionality. So,
yeah, we're talking with a client right now about the idea of using custom off-the-shelf solutions as their database, as their management system for all their data, but we're just building the reporting system for them.
Yeah.
Like the idea of like, hey, we have to build a custom UI for everything. We're starting to see some shifts in thinking about that and understanding that, hey, these tools that you can buy off the shelf are pretty powerful and have a lot of flexibility and have the pluggability to be able to say, hey, let's connect our custom pieces to it, rather than building a whole system from the ground up. And we're finding some success in reaching out to those particular niches as well.
Yeah, it's like kind of the shift that happened several years back with content management systems, where content management systems was a front end and back end all together, one package, and now there are more than one headless CMSs out there.
There's a whole that's actually a ridiculously big segment now. There's like 20 competing headless CMSs.
Yeah, and so it's like, okay, well, here's your CMS. It's got all your data. Here's a way it's got a ways to update it, and then you build whatever front end you want for it that displays that data from the CMS. And that was the real problem, because back then people didn't want someone who picked up a CMS to look like everyone else who had picked up that same CMS.
Yeah. So this kind of got me wondering, actually, a diversion from our topics on our overall list here. I wonder if more of the kind of enterprise data systems that we often work on should be built where the layout, the styling, and so on of the screens is actually under control of a CMS rather than under control of our development team.
Like hard coded as part of the development.
Yeah, some ways. I wonder if there's a way to use a CMS to control, almost every aspect of the layout of the screen, the styling, the order, and so on, and then only have the behavior coded in Angular or React or whatever we're using on the project in question.
Yeah, actually, I was on a project that a portion of their application dealt with forms in a doctor's office. And each doctor's office, they sold it as a service to different doctor's offices. And so each doctor's office might set up their forms differently. So we had a form builder, which allowed you to WYSIWYG, drag and drop, and put things all over the place, edit the form, add things in, remove things, etc. And then all of that was stored in a database, which in our conversation could be a CMS with all that info.
Yeah.
And then someone who would use that form would see a static version of it, and they could just edit it. It's totally something that's doable and has been done. It is not super easy. You definitely want to spend your 7 hours talking about it and figuring out what your actual requirements are.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a path out there where you tool that up to where it becomes easy, right? So here's the way I'm imagining it. I'm imagining it here's from an Angular point of view, and I will use this recording to demonstrate we stated this idea for anyone listening out there who thinks they're going to go grab this idea and run away with it. What if instead of in my Angular template, I put a whole bunch of HTML, CSS, I put a whole bunch of material, map this and map that, I bring in my prime whatever components. What if instead of doing all of that, I just put some sort of headless CMS wrapper component as the top level component, and then I just dropped all my other components directly in, and maybe gave them a name or something, some way to differentiate them from each other. And then that's all I did in Angular. Then I used some CMS behind the scenes to runtime define the translation between here are the 8 components, and here's the other 500 kilobytes of DOM that has to be created to implement a design system, etc. I wonder if there's a path out there that just takes huge chunks of what are currently using up cycles in development, burning up 3/4 of each iteration or each sprint on some projects, if you're a Scrum sort of person. Some way of just chucking a bunch of that and saying, yeah, we actually don't do that in this project. In this project, we have the right controls beyond the screen with the right behavior. And then in this parallel project, we use whatever off-the-shelf system to create the desired layout. Now, of course, there's a lot can go wrong in this sort of very high-level idea, right? Because it will very often turn out that the things people want are actually at the intersection of behavior and appearance, not in isolation. So I'm not saying that there's like some way to snap your fingers and solve all problems, but I do think there's maybe some there's like this axis of incidental layout with functionality that the default you get if you just follow the way the tools guide you is you jumble them all up. You interleave them, not even line by line, but literally you interleave them as different characters on the same line of every line of code on your application by default. And I would love to have a way to more fulsomely rip those things apart.
Yeah, it's almost like a framework, like depending upon how deep you want to get. I mean, you can always structure your application so that you can swap out CSS files and get a completely different look and feel.
Yeah, I mean,
I think what you're digging at is something deeper than that.
Yeah, CSS is great. Reference my own blog post, but not linked to it. So a long time ago, like probably a decade ago, I wrote a blog post about, hey, we all need to take CSS more seriously than we have been. I don't know if it's worked or not yet, but we
all gave up and moved to Tailwind.
Yeah, I think the Tailwind people saw that. It's like, let's just like flip this table over instead. What do you think? Forget that serious. Anyway, no, CSS is great, but it is nowhere near the level of power for the kind of thing I'm imagining. Anyway, the kind of thing I'm imagining would be a potentially substantial quantity of DOM, CSS, and JavaScript, all being under the control of a visual control layer, not tangled up with the data flow architecture layer of a system.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so I guess we can lump all that under, are we building the right application?
Well, when I heard that phrase, my mind went somewhere entirely different. I was thinking about the communication and logistics challenges of the telephone game that happens between users, project managers, and the development teams that are required to implement them.
Yeah,
that's where my mind went.
Is that similar to the? Is what you're thinking similar to the tire swing sort of cartoon?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Where
the XKCD tire swing. Let me see if I can.
The kid just wants a swing and a tire, a rope and a tire attached to the tree, and depending upon who gets it, there's like 3 or 4 different implementations that end up coming out.
Unfortunately, the XKCD that you get searching for tire swing is a different one, not the one we're all thinking of. But anyway, there's a famous cartoon that hopefully anybody watching this remembers what that famous cartoon is. But so Paul, I think partly it's a telephone game. But I sometimes think that that's like an oversimplification, or like not even that. That's like letting some people off the hook. I think there are often genuine disagreements by stakeholders on what a system should do, and that some of the rough edges that can come out that are, I mean, it's like they're like I believe in like assuming the best of everyone, but sometimes after you assume the best of everyone, which is you assume there's a telephone game, sometimes it actually turns out that there is a genuine disagreement. And so now you need to pivot assuming the best to assume that all the players that have a genuine disagreement in how a system should work and what it should do and what it should look like all have good reasons why they want what they want. But they don't agree, and so they're not merely having a communication telephone game challenge. Sometimes not everybody wants the same application to be built. That shouldn't surprise any of us, right? I mean, but
it's kind of where scope creep and other things like that happen, where you don't have agreement or consensus on what you're building, and so you get someone else going, well, I really want this thing, and it may not even be nefarious. It just may be a mix-up in communication, but they're like, well, we should have this feature and this feature and this feature, or this minor change here and there. And then you end up with 3 applications, which really should have just been one, but they're all in one application. So
right. You end up with like 3 different screens, each of which have not just a little bit different appearance, but a little bit different like understanding of the semantics of the problem being solved.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because people are bad at their job. It's because the people working on those three don't agree on what the correct interpretation is of the problem to be solved. And I think that getting a team of size to really come to good agreement on exactly what they're trying to build is like a fundamental and very hard problem of software development. In fact, it's probably a harder and more important problem than should we use microservices, should we use micro front ends, how should we type our interfaces, which I still want to talk about. Like this, getting like full agreement on what you're trying to build, I think is probably a much better, stronger, longer lever in terms of getting great results than even, dare I say, upgrading from Angry 11 to 12.
Yeah. And unfortunately, sometimes, like even at the architecture level, a lot of those decisions have already been made by the time it gets to someone like me or you guys.
Sure.
And you can have some input and you can ask questions and leading questions and get them to think. And maybe there's some reflection and they come back and there's some changes. But
I think fundamentally there is no them though. There's just different size circles with us in them.
Right. And
because we are they, right? We are them.
I mean,
we have seen the enemy.
We have, and there are times when I communicate with my teams and I am the them. But it's one of those things of it does come down to communication. It's like, when does that communication happen? If you include too many people in the early communication, nothing's going to get done, or it's going to end up this giant, ball of mashed potatoes. But it's, but if you don't include enough people, you end up with, the tire swing analogy.
So I'm not going to try to patent this, but here's the thing I think people should do. If you have a big team, say there's 400 people working across, 8 sub-teams in an organization, all kind of very arm's length collaborating toward a goal, you should occasionally get together varying subsets of the leaders and varying subsets of the people who want the system, whoever's paying for it, whoever needs it, and have them get together and do what we're doing here and talk on a video podcast about how it's going and what it's supposed to do, and then let everyone watch.
Aside from the video podcast, that sounds a lot like Agile and Safe Agile.
No, because I'm actually so Safe is easy to go wrong with, and I always we have a sister company that can help you, dear listener, go right with it. But I'm actually talking about a different axis, not the sort of like, are we doing the right process thing? I'm actually advocating that orthogonal to process, just getting wideband human communication that flows, very widely across an organization, instead of through process-defined pathways and tunnels, can help reach that group shared understanding of what exactly are we trying to build here.
I have a story about that.
Yes, stories welcome.
So,
is this like a work story, or like I was sitting by a pond story?
No, this is more of a work story.
Okay.
These kind of work stories make me wish I were sitting by a pond. No, this was one of my very first times when I was kind of leading out on a client project. So I was still, full of naive hope for the world, and I was working on this project, and I was, pretty tightly managed by a representative at the client, and worked for probably 6-8 months, and had a lot of progress to show for it. Things were moving really, really well. And then I finally met a user for the first time.
Oh no.
And so they made the mistake of like getting all of these broad spans of people in the same room, as far as I could tell, for the first time.
And you were there to see it happen?
Yeah, I was there. I was one of the people, and they had me demo what I had. And it turns out the people who would end up being the users of this system, they were not happy. They did not want or even care about the thing that was being built. And the executives that were paying for it, turns out they ended up not caring that the users didn't want to or care for what was being built. They wanted to see built what they wanted to see built. And so
Nice.
I ended up kind of at the center of like, there is no way to make anyone happy here.
Yeah.
Or if I am going to make someone happy, it's just going to be the people who are paying for it. That this thing will end up never being used.
Yeah,
And
you can't make everybody happy. The only
right.
people that can make everybody happy there were the execs that wanted that feature, even though the customers didn't.
Now this ultimately ends up leading to the project getting canceled whenever folks realize that, oh, hey, this isn't actually. But it took 6 to 8 months or so of my time really focused on this project, and a small team focused on this project, and all the money being spent on that before the right people even got in the room to find out that what was being built wasn't even wanted by anyone.
So you know that thing about spending a day writing first? If it's a bunch of people, you should probably spend a few days meeting first too.
Yeah.
Yep.
I have the other end of the spectrum. Your story reminded me. The company that I worked for, the same one that did the medical stuff, they held a conference every year and invited all their users, and you could go there and they'd show, here's what's coming in the next year, etc. And they actually brought a fair amount of our dev team and QA and a bunch of other people from the company to the conference. And so we could talk directly. There was a mixer where we could talk directly with people and ask them, how, do you have any issues or what is your number one thing that you would like to see added or fixed? And one of the things that they did was they allowed the users themselves to pay for new features. And what they did was they would sell ping pong balls, and they would say, here are the 3 or 4 new features that we are planning to roll out. And it could be new fixes as well that we are planning to roll out. Put your ping pong ball in this, mesh trash can, and the one with the most ping pong balls, our dev team will work on at this conference and start it off.
Wow.
And then by the end of the conference, we will show you the prototype of that thing
that is
you
amazing.
voted for on night 1.
That is a bold move.
That is. Yeah. I am
Sounds
impressed.
like a disaster waiting to happen.
It was 2 days of a lot of lack of sleep.
Were you informed before showing up that you were going to be?
We were informed of the 4 possible things so that we could kind of think about and plan and architect like what would need to happen if we did this. And we kind of arranged them in the ones that like, hey, put in a different number 4 instead of this one, because this one is just crazy in terms of like how much we would have to do in 2 days in order to accomplish this. So we would not, because we always wanted to be able to show progress and an actual set of screens that did what they said they were going to do. In addition to that, occasionally they would go out to an actual office, and the creator of the company was also a doctor. And so we'd go out to his practice and go through his stuff and watch how they actually use the software, which was immensely helpful. Because if you were in the ordering area, you'd watch people fly over the keyboard and not even touch the mouse, and realize that keyboard usage was super important. And having to click through 1 or 2 extra screens or 1 or 2 extra buttons was just slowing them down.
Yeah.
And wasn't giving, and those extra screens were not giving them any use, even though in another area of the company or another area of the office, they might actually be used a lot. So maybe we adjust the workflow if you're in the ordering set of screens and you put those other screens solely in, another area. That I'm trying to be not too vague,
Yeah.
but
No,
also not too
I love
specific.
the idea of paying attention to critical workflows being able to be keyboard only. And there's actually nothing about running in a web browser that stops you from doing that. You absolutely can make a web app do a great job of that.
Mhm.
But I think that's an area that many applications just don't devote enough effort to. And that even a modest effort regularly on projects to, hey, let's make sure that this app works well with a minimum-ish number of keystrokes.
I mean, how many coders do you know that code and know their IDE so well, they know all the shortcut keys and everything else like that, and have told you, I don't like to touch my mouse because it slows me down.
Yeah, I mean, most developers touch the mouse not that often, but then they forget that
Users are the same way.
Yeah, that power users or heavy users who are not developers have a similar preference.
Yeah.
And it's just easy to forget that, especially, I'd say it's especially easy with web to forget that.
Like I've seen some, and this is where UX design can really shine, but it's also often forgotten. Like I've seen UX stuff where you're filling out a form and it knows there's only 6 characters that can be entered. And so you enter 6 characters and it automatically goes to the next thing. You don't have to hit tab, or if you're on a phone, it's automatically going to the next piece, which for the majority of users, that's exactly what they want. They don't want to have to touch a screen.
Or even more basically, pay attention to your tab orders.
That too. Yep.
Yeah.
So Kyle, we've been doing Agile like more formally now as an industry for the last couple of decades.
Indeed.
What's the winner? Is something more waterfall-like or something more Agile-like more likely to reduce this problem of building the right thing?
At the very beginning of Agile, one of the key early players, and I don't want to get it wrong, so I won't. I think I might remember which one, but I won't say because I don't want to be wrong. Observed that no matter how you slice it, process, including Agile process, should be thought of as a second order, lesser determinant of project success, and that is nearly irrelevant compared to the power of having the right people on a project. People with a team with great skill at the technology being used, great understanding of the problem being solved in the problem domain. That team with just randomly picking a process is, orders of magnitude better than the perfect process and then slot in developers according to some, straightforward criteria. Now, the problem is that the second one is much easier to achieve as a scaled organization, but the first one is way better. So I would say that, process is fine, but it's better to find a way to recast a project in a way that a small team of the most capable people can do it, and then have the team choose the process, which is sort of the Agile way. That's kind of the essence of Agile, right? Is self-directed teams. That said, we also help people who have the opposite problem, right? They're trying to solve the problem of how do I coordinate 1,000 or multi-thousand people working together toward a goal, and they tend to put a lot of focus on process because the process is more stable and the people keep switching in and out. Yeah.
There's a speaker author, Simon Sinek, that I think that dovetails into what you're just talking about. And he's very much in the idea of an infinite mindset for business. Rather than trying to find the perfect 10x developers and superstar people so that you have a huge velocity graph if you're using Agile. He would much rather have a good, consistent, mediocre team, because that mediocre team can consistently produce results time after time after time. Whereas usually like the superstars will come in and maybe burn out really quick or feel under too much pressure, et cetera. Or maybe they're overworking themselves. And so
I would say as an investor, I would probably choose that. As a team member or as a person putting together a team for a project, I would not choose that. I would aim for people who are really, really great.
Well, there's really great, but
well, you used the word mediocre a few minutes ago.
Yeah, I did. And yeah, I'm using the wrong words. What I'm trying to get across is not like use the bottom of the barrel or the middle of the barrel developers. Use consistent developers, not developers who do this, where they're bouncing up and down in terms of productivity. He wants a nice, solid, steadily increasing graph of improvement. And what you were talking about earlier of process versus I don't know what to call it, but what process in my mind really should do, and what Agile was originally decades ago thought of for, is to increase communication at all levels.
Yeah.
And that's really what we've been talking about, is to make sure that from the top level of a project down to whoever is, QA, dev, whatever, and really it's not a top or bottom sort of thing, but like everybody at all areas of the company who's involved with that project should be able to communicate effectively, and make sure that information doesn't get lost or backed up, or there aren't bottlenecks, and that everybody has a good understanding of the project. And the better understanding of a project and what the users want, and what will please the users, the better the project is going to turn out.
Yeah, I was gonna say one of the, there's different expressions of the agile ideas, but one of the short ones that I've seen, it said is the most easily forgotten one is people over process.
Yes. And like if you have like you had talked about, a project with thousands of developers, and they want a process because their people are switching out so often.
Yeah, and I'm not saying in the generics. I'm saying literally at our sister company, we help companies that have thousands of people whose work needs to be coordinated.
Right.
And if you have a tiny organization with only a few handfuls of people, someone arriving or leaving is like a rare momentous event. If you have thousands of people all, pursuing career paths and so on, well, literally every single day, some people are starting and leaving.
But
and so the things people work with to solve that problem, it's a very different problem to solve than a small team getting great results.
And that really big company that has that churn, that or attrition or whatever you want to call it, one thing that with that many people moving in and out, it's really easy to forget to ask the question, why are they leaving? Why are they coming in?
Yeah, that's a whole separate question.
But that's a question.
I was saying, assuming a good and low quit rate reflective of a well-run organization, at scale, there's still people leaving and arriving every day. Now, if you have a toxic organization that has a high quit rate, then
process isn't going to fix that.
It can get out of control. It can be really hard to deal with. But I'm saying even if everything is going great at a certain size, right?
How do you scale it? That's what Agile was trying to do, was take very small teams and expand it out to 1,000-person teams.
The original, the Agile Manifesto, that group of people doing that were actually not working on that problem. They were working on the problem of how to get great results of teams of up to dozens of people was kind of the original scope started with.
Okay, so not thousands of people.
And then a lot of work has been done since then. A lot of thoughts, a lot of writing, a lot of stuff you can buy, which our sister company sells, to help do that, to help do things appropriate for thousands of people. And it's not the same, right? Coordinating the work of thousands of people is very different than coordinating the work of people that can fit in one room.
Yeah, there are like tiers or cutoffs of like, hey, this will work up to about here. And then that process breaks down. And that doesn't mean that process is bad. It just means it doesn't fit. It's just like us talking about what framework to use for what project, or what language, or is it a mobile app or a web app? It depends on the project. It depends on the scale. Like if I'm going to build a website or a web app for 5 people, I'm going to build it one way. If I'm going to build it for 1,000 people, I'm going to build it a completely different way, because they're 2 different animals.
If I'm going to do it for 5 people, I might just not build it. It's not enough of an audience.
Yeah. If it's just 5 people, unless I'm getting paid
I'm going to tell them to use Excel per our earlier discussion. I'm just going to send them a link to go where they can go download Excel.
Yeah. It's like, here's Google Sheets.
Yeah. Here's a Google Sheet. Solve your problem.
Here's a notebook and a pencil.
Yeah.
Pass it
as
around.
long as we're doing spicy hot takes, although in our sister company, we sell and support high-end, incredibly capable project management software, nonetheless, at the very beginning of a very small project, I often intentionally use like starting with an empty document or starting with an empty spreadsheet as the way to start sketching out the general shape, and then graduate to more and more kind of like official structured tools over time as an effort matures. Mm-hmm. I think that one of the other essences of agility is to having the right amount of process for the problem and situation in front of you. That whole, when we have on our list here, first time is coordinating at scale. And so I think one of the important things is to, once you've learned how to coordinate at scale, you have to remember to only use those tools when you actually have scale. Yeah. Not use tools for coordinating at scale for like the 3 of us to get together and choose a lunch location.
Yeah. I mean, you don't start a small project and go, okay, I'm going to use NX and Angular and RxJS and NGRX store.
I actually do that.
All that together.
Well, if we want to talk about Angular specifics, which, for those that are watching that don't care about Angular, bear with us. We actually have found that some tools that are initially presented as, oh, here's the tool you need to make bigger stuff, once you've mastered, it's actually not any more work. There actually isn't any actual real overhead in adopting the next tier up of tools, even on tiny things.
Like if I was going to do a tiny thing and I've chosen to use Angular, I would still use NX.
Yeah, me too.
NX makes more sense. Sure. But I wouldn't necessarily use NGRX store because I might not need that, for whatever reason.
Well, I've heard there were 2 new state management libraries for Angular, both announced this week already, and it's only Tuesday.
Yep.
So
another 3 or 4 by the end of the week, maybe.
Yeah. Here we go. Maybe we could have like another podcast that would just be, we would review a different Angular state management solution every week. And the question is, how many weeks could we go before we had to repeat? And I think the answer is infinitely many, because they're being created at a rate of more than 1 per week on average. Yeah. And so between the backlog and the creation rate, it would never run out.
Well, then you could compare and contrast them, and then ask the question of why are these better than, what's common? Why are these better than each other, etc.
It is so
infinite
tough.
Content there if we want.
It is so, actually that ties into our big topic. Are we building the right thing? Right?
Yep.
Part of building the right thing is choosing what foundation to build your thing on top of. And it is legitimately, gruelingly hard in technology to to even understand what the options are to try to make a wise decision of what infrastructure to build on.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard from like an architecture standpoint to choose those pieces because there's so many and you are guaranteed not to have used all of them.
Yeah, right. There's too many choices for any one person to be up to speed. It's impossible.
Yeah, it's super easy to go and reach for the thing you've used already or the brand new shiny thing.
Those are the two defaults.
But
those are the defaults. The thing I used last month and whatever the shiniest and newest is. But, statistically, the chances of either of those being optimal is relatively low for any given choice you're making.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're gone an hour, so let's pivot to the thing we haven't done much with that I happen to think Paul is probably the relevant expert on. Paul, I'm going to spend 4 person years on a project. 4 people working for a year. Figure out how many, roughly speaking, 7,000 or 8,000 hours of work. What % of those hours should go into testing versus writing the thing under test?
Do you care if it works?
Since this is me, I care about that more than anything else. However, if you have input on like what kind of situations might drive somebody to more or less testing, I bet that would be interesting to our audience.
Well, so the next question is, how do you care about receiving a report on whether or not it works? Is my telling you, oh yeah, this thing works great, is that sufficient? Or is it like, no, I really need to like.
So we'll assume for the sake of argument,
because yes, everything works.
That I care that the thing works, in that it's going to be a thing that makes money. I'm going to take the thing that's being created, and I'm going to send it to people with a bill. And if it mostly works, they're probably going to pay the bill. And if it's kind of broken in a bunch of important ways, I'm going to have a bunch of squabbles with my customers, and I'm not going to get their money. So yeah, I needed to. I don't really care about a report per se, but I do actually care quite a lot that my software works, because let's assume for the sake of argument that I'm getting my own money out to pay for it, right? So, but I think there are some really interesting differences that you see between projects that are sponsored by someone with their own money and projects that are sponsored by someone with organizational money. And I'm not saying that the own money is always better. I think sometimes own money projects have their own challenges, but there are definitely differences along that axis. But go ahead. So
I'm going to answer.
My test. It's important that it works, but I don't really care about a report. I don't have time to read reports.
So you are at the high end of like, no, and testing actually does matter compared to what most people say. And so I'm going to give you a non-answer, and that is, well, in that case, like, testing isn't a thing that I can even differentiate the way I'm going to run that project.
Interesting.
I'm going to test and tool the software so that the development, tooling, and testing of it is all the same process.
Yeah. There is no testing as part of development. It's not a separate thing from development.
All right, I'm going to start from day one with a framework that, like, as I develop this feature, I verify it as I go. Yeah. And I'm going to tool the software to treat the testing framework as a client of the system. Yeah. So that's a non-question. How many hours is spent doing it? Like all of them.
All of them. Yeah.
You spend less hours if you are doing testing while you're developing than if you did it afterward. Or try and retrofit it in.
Well, so I think that there's a subtle difference between the two ideas. So there's the idea of like forever, since testing has become a hot topic, people have said like, yes, you get better results, faster results if you test as you're going and test earlier than if you were to do it later or not at all. I don't disagree with that, but I'm suggesting something that is subtly different, and that the testing and the verification tools and framework should be treated as a client of the system.
Yeah.
Like it is not so much a like testing is a thing that's done early. It's like creating this test environment that verifies a behavior is the only thing we're trying to achieve.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as an example, from a real world example for me, is I really like using SonarQube on the projects that I'm on. And I often build that into the build system so that when a new pull request comes in, it runs through SonarQube's verification checks. And if it fails any of those verification checks, including like unit test coverage has dropped, or the new code that's going in doesn't meet a sufficient threshold of unit test coverage, it will not let that PR in.
Yeah, and those are mechanics of the implementation.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to answer the more philosophical bit to this, which is like, how much at the extreme end of like desirability for correctness is that it is, to try and separate them would be fundamentally breaking, the process of shipping the working software.
So Paul, would an example that you're saying be that the really impressive demo you did for me a while back? I know you're just like getting ready for a talk you were doing, where you were basically developing some software. This is a GUI you were developing, and you were basically using Cypress as your browser while you were developing. And so you weren't like developing and then doing some Cypress tests.
Yeah, I didn't alt-tab over to Chrome.
Right, you were developing...
to manually make it. I wasn't using Cypress to...
it wasn't a validation
afterwards.
Right? Yeah, you weren't validating with Cypress. You were literally like line by line as you went. The tests and the code were balancing each other and checking each other.
Yeah, I used Cypress. So kind of like we were talking about earlier, how developers don't like to leave the keyboard and go touch the mouse.
Yeah.
Similarly, like I do everything I can to not go use Chrome and exercise the feature manually.
Yeah.
As I'm building the feature, I go make the Cypress test to exercise the thing I'm trying to build and just continue to do that. And I tool the software I'm building to enable that capability.
So you basically, you never do the thing where you have created some untested functionality because you're using the testing tool second by second as you're creating the functionality.
Right.
And I also imagine that when you are writing software like that, it's a very test-driven development like
idea.
But that's more of an end-to-end test or an integration test, depending upon how you define those things. But I imagine that you write that software differently, knowing that you're also going to be writing the Cypress test at the same time.
Yeah,
so that it is easier to test.
Yeah.
Well, it hits all of the highlights of things like I am more aware of the ability to tool my website and to make it more accessible, and all of those various niceties that are usually afterthoughts.
Yeah.
Those kind of have to be figured out earlier and more upfront when you are programmatically manipulating the software than if you allow a user to kind of blunt force figure out a way to kind of like to force it to work, if you will. Like a user is so fault tolerant to a degree that, especially if you're the one writing it, like there's so many little things that you forgive and that you overlook when you're trying to make a thing work. That if you are programmatically trying to work through this system, you can't mess it up even a little bit. Or it's just not going to work. Especially when we talk about like the end-to-end functionality, like the ability to stand up, reproduce this system in multiple environments, be able to point it to a new backend, being able to run the same feature over and over again. Like the tools that you have to kind of develop up front are something that you may not end up with otherwise. So not only do your features end up better, but your infrastructure and your tooling packages end up better as well. Like the ability to add more people to the project.
Yeah.
Well, I stand up Cypress tests that can reproduce this functionality and run them 100 times in a row. So I know that someone else, once properly configured, they're going to be able to stand up and have their own environment as well.
Yeah.
Right. And I can totally see how, like I've worked on more than one, many more than one enterprise applications where it takes, in order to test a piece of functionality, you have to dig so deep into the application before you can even test it. Like, like 20 minutes of doing stuff just to set up something. And I could totally see how if you're writing code the way that you're talking about with doing Cypress tests from the beginning, that sort of situation wouldn't happen, because
it could never happen.
So that you can test it easily.
Right, it literally couldn't happen because you wouldn't ever write code that does such a feature without scaffolding the tests along the way.
Right.
You're putting in the pieces you need for testing along the way.
Yeah.
Of course, I mean that sort of thing sounds outrageous to people who have never developed in the way you're describing before. It sounds really like kind of over the top. Like, how could anybody ever do that?
And when I show up, midway into client projects that are kind of struggling to get across the finish line, I certainly can't stop the world to make their system conform to those kind of properties to do that. But I absolutely take the client's project steps in that direction every time I touch it.
Yeah.
And so it's, I don't do that every day, every project, but ones that I'm in charge of, have the greenfield startup cycle with, I absolutely prepare to be capable of doing that.
Yeah. And even ones that have been there for years, possibly, if they don't have an end-to-end testing set up already, adding in Cypress it's an effort, but it's not an insurmountable effort. And then only adding those Cypress tests on the feature that you're working on can definitely shed a light of, oh, this thing works, and it works right out of the box, and it's tested every single time that we want to run these tests and passes. Maybe we should add more tests in as we're adding new functionality or touching existing functionality.
There are systems which appear as an expert stepping in to try to help. And by appear, I mean they are indistinguishable. There are systems where the design of the system is indistinguishable from one where an evil genius was working to make it impossible to end-to-end test the system. And I would say such systems are not even rare. It is quite common to accomplish and say, this system is quite similar to what it would be if an evil genius was trying to make it hard to test.
Yeah, I can give you an example of one of those.
Yeah.
Like the kind of stack that I see most common that falls into that. I have students that show up in a Cypress class all the time, and they get through the whole Cypress class, and then at the end they say, well, in our situation, what we've got going on is we have a monolithic backend. There's only one copy. No one has the source code to stand up the second copy. Furthermore, that backend is designed in a way where we use it for development, staging, and production. We make that backend in such a way where it has an RPC-based interface that requires us to make an initial request, and then we have to pull while we wait for an answer from it. And then they make a front end that doesn't have any route-based state management at all for user navigational state. It's not in the URL. It's usually in something like they'll make a WebSocket connection or something like that, and save the settings on a back end. And make it possible to differentiate how to actually connect to a test user versus their own user. And you put all those things together, and while I have a formula for how to E2E test such a system, I always say, and my condolences, because it's not going to be fun. It can be done. It's not going to be fun.
This is easy. I just test it by logging into production with my credentials, and I just be careful. It's fine. We don't have a problem here.
Yeah, I've been on way too many projects that are like that, where like just the idea of, like, say there's a workflow that creates a ticket. And you go through that workflow and create a ticket, even if it's like in the QA environment, that ticket suddenly shows up. But then when you try to use those same, there's not a way to roll it back. And so you're using that same test again, it's going to instantly fail because it's going to say, hey, you just did this. This information's already in there. There's a different mindset of how to do that.
So the witty description for this I've heard is, don't tell me your team doesn't have a test environment. I mean, literally every team has a test environment. It's just that some teams have the luxury of not running production in their test environment.
Yeah. So your original question, though, was like testing how much and when.
Yeah.
And I went straight to E2E tests.
Yeah, you went to the when, which is while you're coding. It's not a separate activity. It's part of the same activity.
Well, some people might be surprised that I went straight to E2E tests also.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that surprised me. Usually my go-to is straight to unit tests.
And Paul, I'm with you 100%.
But up until recently, E2E tests were like super hard at the top of the pyramid, but Cypress makes it a lot less hard.
Yeah, I gave a talk on Cypress at a conference, and part of that was to describe why Cypress is so important. And my thesis was the idea that Cypress is changing the structure of the testing pyramid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I gave some background, like the testing pyramid is shaped as a pyramid with that base of unit tests, because at the time in which the idea of the testing pyramid was formulated, the cost of writing and maintaining E2E tests was extremely high. And so we had to have fewer of them because they were just too expensive. But with tools like Cypress coming out that lower that barrier to get effective E2E test coverage, the shape of that pyramid is starting to like have a weird, almost hourglass shape now.
Yep.
And
Or you move it down and it shares with unit tests as the base or something like that.
Or something.
Yeah.
But yes, it's absolutely Cypress has a big role in that.
Yeah, and that also, that assumes that you also have a backend or a mock backend that can support a quick running of those Cypress tests and rolling back of things.
I partially agree with that. To me, the making the backend E2E testable is as big of a responsibility. It's like part of that same bulk of responsibility that I described of from right out of the gate, I'm going to make the system testable. That means creating a backend that can be stood up multiple times independently, easily, and made such that when I write a feature in it, my E2E tests are going to work round trip with it.
Yeah. Paul, some people,
I think that's.
Yeah, go ahead.
I consider that people end up with backends that can't, but I think that is a failing of the architecture, design, and implementation, rather than we haven't had the technology before. Like we've always have, and will continue to always write bad backends, and I think they've all been easily all been E2E testable. It's not really a framework or a technology problem. I think that the backend thing has always been just an excuse, in my opinion.
So people don't like hard truths, but they don't have to tune in to our video podcast. So the hard truth here is, if you're telling me your backend is untestable, it's impossible to stand up a new one, it's impossible to decouple from production, it's impossible to reset the data state, it's impossible to automate it. The only way to roll out a new one is a human process that's 4 days long, and we have a book we wrote up about it. Then what you're telling me is that the correctness of your backend is not that important to you. And that if the correctness of a system is important, then among other tools, testing is not magic, but among other tools, you need to have a system, a command that can be run, we'll call that a test, which takes the backend, or takes any system, takes it through its paces, and verifies that it does the things you'll expect it to do when it's taken through its paces. And that applies to a backend, that applies to a UI, and that applies to any other piece of software or to some extent even to other kinds of systems, right? I mean, there are giant hordes of engineers devising ways of testing mechanical systems. And I believe they have somewhat similar lines of reasoning. It's like, well, if it's important that this bracket holds under load, then I guess we're going to have to find a way to test that this bracket can take the load. And if you tell me you don't have time to test that the bracket is going to hold, then what you're telling me is it's not that important that it holds.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that applies to a chunk of metal in a somewhat similar way as it applies to a million-line software system.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it when you say something is impossible, what I hear is we are not willing to spend the time or money to make sure that it works when it's really needed.
And when I hear it, I say, let me go prepare up a contract to engage Oasis Digital.
Right.
And the impossible will merely turn out to be difficult.
Yeah. I was once on a contract that they spent millions of dollars a year with humans going in and manually editing a database because people would go in, their users would go in and something would happen and something would go wrong. And they had their answer to it was spending millions of dollars a year to manually edit a database rather than fix their backend, fix their middleware and backend pieces.
I always assume that there's some really complex.
Brought in to fix that.
I assume there's like some really complex organizational reason, right? Like there are probably good reasons that are really hard to understand from the outside how an organization could convince themselves to pay humans to keep editing a database versus fixing the software once.
Yeah, something happened in that organization, and that's why we were hired. So
yeah.
different company that I worked for at that point. But yeah, someone finally said, no, this is now unacceptable.
Yeah,
we need to cut that out of our costs. And for some companies, that is okay. You know, if they're making tons of money, you know, it's just like any business. You know, if a business goes out and does something illegal and gets fined for it, $1 million, but they're making $10 million, that's just the cost of doing business. They're not going to necessarily stop, even if they know they're going to accrue $1 million fine every single year. They're still making $9 million.
You know,
if it's going to cost them,
I hear that analogy a lot.
Yeah,
I don't think it's actually that common of a behavior at large businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Usually it's more along the lines of a fine happened, but the world has changed so much by the time the fine actually came to pass that the situation that led to it has become obsolete anyway. And so it's like, yeah, we did some things a few years ago. We got fined. We made a ton of money. I guess we'd do it again, but actually we're doing totally different things now. Maybe we'll get fined for those different things. But the only case I can think of where like people just routinely are just willing to get fined again and again are things like organizations that do deliveries that have a budget for parking tickets. Mm-hmm. Because they found that it's cheaper to pay the parking tickets because they can do 50 deliveries a day if they're willing to get on average 1 ticket a day. But if they park correctly to never get any tickets, they can only do 30 deliveries a day, something like that. But
well, I don't think any company is going to consistently get the same fine. Over and over again.
That's what I was getting at. It's very rare to keep having the exact same thing happen. It's normally
it's not
different
it's never
things.
The exact same thing, but they are realizing that we are willing to cross the line of legality and incur a price, and we are willing to pay that price because we are willing to make more money.
I need to take a note here that if anybody brings up the possible need for a compliance department, to please not recommend Mr. Moore.
Well, I would just save them the money in the first place and not cross that line.
Okay, well, I think. Go ahead.
I was curious. Like I was trying to pick a fight about the unit testing, but it doesn't sound like I'm going to get it from you guys.
No, I mean, Cypress makes it a lot easier now. If I was using Protractor or even worse, Selenium, but they were great for their time, but they were very, very cumbersome to use. And Cypress is part of a new breed of end-to-end testing that makes things a lot easier. People solved the problems and are continuing to solve the problems of what makes end-to-end testing difficult.
So I look at it more broadly than that. So I use end-to-end in the generic sense, not in the sense of web tooling automation, web automation test tooling. I mean end-to-end testing of, does this overall piece of software achieve the thing that it's supposed to achieve? So taking it in that sense, I think that end-to-end is actually a lot more valuable than unit tests. And that really, in a sense, the base of the pyramid in terms of importance ought to be, do we have tests that validate this system as a whole, at least does some major swaths of what whoever is paying for it needs it to do? And then a tool to help achieve that along the way is to pick out pieces of code in the middle that seem particularly prone to fail in detailed ways and put unit tests around those.
Yeah. Like your bracket analogy, if the bracket is super critical to the functioning of your robot,
yeah,
then you definitely want to be testing the bracket. But if the camera doesn't matter, then the testing of the camera can come later.
Yeah. So for example, let's say your robot is a robot that paints cars. Mm-hmm. The most important test is that I put a car in at the beginning of the conveyor, and then it comes out, and then I inspect the paint job at the other end, and I validate that the system as a whole did the thing that it's supposed to do.
Right.
And then to achieve that might include kind of mechanical unit tests, like, is this bracket strong enough? And it's probably going to include a lot of software unit tests to the software that controls the thing. But I would argue that none of those is as vital as the end-to-end test of, does this overall system perform the task that it's hired to, the thing that does it do the thing it's supposed to do?
Yeah, as long as the robot is painting the car and has the final result be what you consider correct, it doesn't matter what path that robot arm takes to paint.
Well, it may matter. I mean, it may be that some paths are better. So there can be a lot more, but the most important thing is the end-to-end.
Yes.
That it does that you get the correct result, and then the other can be. I mean,
you can refine it and make it better.
Yeah, I mean, there are performance, there are simulation tests. That's like a whole world of interesting things. Yeah. There are performance tests. We're actually getting some of those out of the box now with the tooling we use. So again, for people who don't follow us in the like the enterprise Angular space, the tooling we use by default will warn or error us if our bundles get too big, and it does that by default, and we have to turn it off if we don't want it. It's great to have that in the box versus something to maybe add later.
So your guys' like physical description of E2E tests actually may have just broken my mind around the importance of E2E tests and or at least the value in differentiating them from other types of tests.
Okay.
Because you just described, there's this hardware machine that is designed to paint cars, and the most important test is that you put a car in, it comes out painted
correctly, not just painted, but you check the quality and whatever.
But you also described it as a part of the system is a suite of software.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm me and I'm writing that software for that machine,
to
me, the only test that matters is the E2E test that the software produces the correct output as a system.
Yeah.
And so, maybe we're all just like needlessly differentiating unit integration and E2E tests.
Yes.
And maybe the only tests that matter are the ones that verify your layer of work does what it's supposed to do, as contracted with whoever you're responsible reporting to.
Yeah, you can think of it as like systems of varying sizes. And by the way, one of the truths of systems engineering is that it's impossible to accurately and correctly and in a consistent way draw a line of what's around a system. It's never quite clear. But so you can think of a unit testing as testing a little tiny system, maybe testing just one little file of code, and an integration test testing like a system consisting of these 47 files of code, and an end-to-end thing testing these 500 files of code, but that's only, like I said, end-to-end for the software, but the software is actually part of this broader system. And you might have some tests around that broader system that includes other elements.
Yeah. And really, like, if we invert that pyramid sort of thing, and you go, hey, something went wrong, and you realize that the car is not painted correctly, that's when those other types of tests become useful.
Right.
You know, you go through the end-to-end test, and you're like, oh, it failed this end-to-end test in particular. Okay, there's bubbles in the paint. Okay, let's go back a layer and look at the integration tests. Oh, there's these integration tests that are failing. And then you go down to the unit test and you see these unit tests are failing, and you can focus in on the code or the mechanical part or whatever that has failed, that has bubbled up and caused that final test to fail. Yeah. And it really just reduces, at the end of the day, it reduces the amount of time that it takes for you to find the problem and fix it.
Well, a unique aspect of software, though, getting away from the analogy and sticking to the realities of software, is that software has a unique case of reuse, and that the code I write might in turn be used by 4 other people tomorrow as a unit in what they're building. And you have we're just describing like that boundary idea is not just a hierarchical boundary. There are also like sibling relationships as well. Yeah. And being able to ensure that the unit of work that I am handing off today works and achieves what my supervisor wants, but also I can provide a contract that guarantees to my peers that this is good and usable in these other use cases and scenarios. Like having unit tests would provide that as well.
You're kind of delving into the idea of strong typing as well, with that contract. It goes into our other possible topic of how do you type a back-end service and share that typing with the front end.
I don't know if we're going to get very deep into that one because we're an hour and a half in, but
yeah, I mean, that's a working unit tests basically say, hey, this code is working according to the spec that it's supposed to. And then, you build up on top of that, or in the opposite direction. I mean, writing the end-to-end test is great, but I would write both end-to-end and unit tests at the same time, because yes, I want to make sure that if I put in data into a form, that whatever is supposed to happen happens, and that's my end-to-end test. But I also want to know as soon as possible, if that isn't happening, where is it broken? And that's where the unit test part comes in.
Yeah, so I was able to successfully work my way back to defending, the building of unit testing, but going back to the original assessment of, where do I spend my time and energy? It is still at that layer of responsibility of handoff from myself to someone who's paying me or whoever's managing me. That still at the end of the day, that the value of being able to guarantee that work is, if I only have time to write one kind of test, that's the one I'm going to write.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to me like we should wrap it up on that, because we have all reached the same conclusion fervently, and leave our discussion about typing across layers for a future week. Closing thoughts, or have we nailed it?
Nope.
Okay. I think we're good there. I like the idea that end-to-end tests are no longer the tip of the pyramid, and it's a lot easier to write them nowadays.
Well, I thank our handful of live viewers and our much larger horde of eventual recorded viewers, and remind everyone to subscribe so that you catch the next one, I guess. You're required to do that on every YouTube video, right? And I guess we will see everyone on future weeks.
See ya.
Thanks, everyone.